Now that we've gotten through Unit 1 and studied simple finals A, E, and I, there's actually content that you're going to want to remember now. And while this is a pronunciation course with the main focus being specifically on how to articulate the different syllables of Chinese, it is also giving you a lot of survival Chinese, and you don't want to forget that stuff. But the question is, how do you actually review it? And reviewing is something that when you think about it from school days, it seems very intimidating. It's like, oh, I don't want to do all that boring rote learning, looking at a textbook over and over, cramming things into my head. It's not a very appealing proposition. And so we are going to suggest that you use spaced repetition software. As a matter of fact, we're going to insist that you use it. We made a bunch of flashcard decks, smart flashcard decks, that are directly related to the course content. And so we're going to use a software called Anki, but spaced repetition software is much older than Anki. Spaced repetition software and the spaced repetition system is something that has had over 100 years of research. We'll refer to it as SRS from now on, and it essentially breaks down into the memory side of things and the frequency side of things. So essentially, what SRS has pulled off here is showing you a new fact that you didn't know previously the least amount of times possible so that you still remember it. As a matter of fact, so that you still remember it with a 90 to 95% retention. And this is based on lots and lots of years of research. So originally there were sort of file folders set up and it was like, okay, test, let's show him the fact this day. Okay, he got it right. So let's move it to this second file folder that's set for 2 hours later or 2 days later or whatever it was. And it was just a very complicated system of folders. We have computers now, so we can do it all digitally, which is great. It's the algorithms that are set up in spaced repetition software based on this 100 years of research can help us get this 90 to 95% retention rate, which isn't quite perfect, but hey, that's because our brains aren't perfect, but we're getting pretty darn close with 90 to 95%. But let me get a little bit more specific by looking at this graph from supermemo.com. Supermemo is an awesome website. I would definitely recommend that you guys check it out. Now, if we take a closer look at this graph here, we can see that in the top right corner next to the 100% is the moment that you're learning a new fact. Now, if you never see that fact again, your likelihood of forgetting will naturally increase over time. So the main line between the blue and the orange there, the forgetting curve as it were, is how quickly you're likely to forget something if you never review it again. But what happens is that when you get to that 90% likelihood of remembering, spaced repetition softwares will say to you, now's the time to review. Now's the time to see this again. When that happens, your knowledge of the fact is now a little bit stronger. So if you never saw it again, at that point, it would take longer to get to a 90% likelihood of remembering. So maybe it would take a few days. Then if you get reminded again, the fact is solidified even further, and the forgetting curve gets even shallower, and so forth. This means that it takes a longer period of time for you to get to that point of 90% likelihood of remembering. Thus, the more you get a fact correct in a spaced repetition software, the less often you see it. And if at any point you get something wrong, you can just send it back to the beginning. And this allows you to have more time and space for more new facts. It addresses what is called the brain filter. And this is something we all know. It's a phenomenological thing that happens every day, which is that a lot of mundane, useless information will happen in your day-to-day life, and you don't need to remember it. It's not something that is going to provide you extra value to remember that you opened a can of tuna yesterday or fed your cat. So those particular things are going to be sort of filtered out in the evening. But the problem is, with a new language, your brain filter's filtering everything out. It's going, I don't recognize those sounds. Those sounds do not fit into a previously made pattern, so just sort of forget it. And you need to train your brain, hey, we need to start remembering this stuff, but spaced repetition software and Anki, they do an incredible job of helping your brain to figure out, oh, okay, this is actually important, I guess. So, because I'm getting reminded just enough. And the other great thing about it, too, is that if you just look at a fact like 10 times in a row, just go like, all right, I'm just going to learn this word for camera in Chinese, or I'm going to learn this word for a city somewhere, and you just say it over and over, and you just look at it. Your brain doesn't really see that as being 10 times. It kind of sees it as being one time. What's more effective is pulling it back from your subconscious, letting it leave your conscious mind, process a bit in your unconscious, and then be hooked back, recalled at some point. that's what's actually going to make it an effective memory tool. So that's another reason why the brain filter gets affected. So what effectively ends up happening here with SRS as you're using it is you have the SRS essentially acting as your own reviewing secretary. It's like keeping track. Okay, here's the thing that needs to come up now. Here's the thing that you can put off for a while. And here's some new cards for it. It's like all just automated in the system. And it's beautiful because, again, you see the stuff you're bad at a lot. You don't waste your time with the stuff you're good at. And that allows you to have a 90 to 95% retention rate. But naturally, if it's 90 to 95% retention rate, then 5 to 10% of the time, you're going to forget some stuff. But not to worry. You're still going to memorize it. And the reason is because every time you forget something, you're going to hit wrong in Anki. It's going to basically reset it. It's going to reset it back to being kind of like a new card. And so you'll see it frequently in the short term, and then the interval will grow as it does naturally with SRS. So when we say a 90 to 95% retention rate, we just mean that there's a 90 to 95% likelihood that you'll never forget it. And then of the 5 to 10% that you do forget 1 or 2 or 3 times, you will eventually memorize it. There's no doubt about it. So the key, though, is to do it every day. And of course, the everyday frequency brings us back to the frequency game. So we talked about the memory game, how it addresses the brain filter, and of course, how it addresses the 90 to 95% retention rate in memory based on the 100 years of research. Well, that's all great. But then again, we also have to consider how often these things are coming up.
And we'll talk about that in part 2 of the SRS series, The Frequency Game.